She woke up with a needle mark on her arm and a pregnancy test she never asked for sitting on a stranger's nightstand. 48 hours ago, Selene Vale was a waitress pulling double shifts to keep the lights on. Now she was locked inside a penthouse owned by the most dangerous man on the East Coast, a man who just told her she was carrying his child. She didn't remember consenting to any of it, and the worst part? The way he looked at her wasn't anger, it was ownership. If you want to know how a broke, exhausted woman ended up trapped inside a criminal empire she never asked to join, stay with me until the end. Hit like, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the night the storm changed everything. The rain didn't fall that night. It attacked. Sheets of water hammered the asphalt so hard the street looked like it was boiling. Thunder cracked somewhere above the city, close enough that Selene Vale felt it vibrate in her chest, in her teeth, in the hollowed-out place behind her ribs where hope used to live. She stood in the parking lot of La Maison, the overpriced French restaurant where she'd spent the last 3 years of her life carrying plates for people who wouldn't look her in the eye. Her uniform was soaked through in seconds. The white button-down clung to her skin like a second layer of defeat. Her black flats, the ones she'd duct-taped on the inside because the sole was separating, filled with water on the first step. And her car was gone. Not stolen. Repossessed. She'd known it was coming. 3 missed payments. 2 warning letters she'd shoved into a kitchen drawer because reading them made her hands shake. 1 final voicemail from a collections agent whose voice sounded like he enjoyed delivering bad news. But knowing something is coming and standing in a monsoon, staring at the empty space where your only lifeline used to be, those are 2 very different kinds of pain. Selene pressed her palms against her eyes and breathed. Just breathed. The rain ran down her wrists and dripped off her elbows. Her phone was at 9%. Her apartment was 11 miles away. The last bus had left 40 minutes ago, and she'd missed it because her manager had made her repolish every glass on the bar after a customer complained about a water spot. A water spot. She almost laughed. Almost. But laughing took energy she didn't have, and the cold was starting to settle into her bones with the kind of determination that meant business. She scanned the lot. Empty. The restaurant staff had cleared out fast tonight, scattering to their cars like roaches when the lights flip on. Nobody offered her a ride. Nobody ever did. Selene had learned a long time ago that being quiet and reliable made you invisible. And invisible people don't get rescued. That's when she saw it. A black Aston Martin parked at the far end of the lot, alone, tucked beneath the only working streetlight like it had been placed there by a set designer with a cruel sense of humor. It gleamed under the rain, sleek and arrogant, the kind of car that cost more than everything Selene had ever owned combined and multiplied by 10. She walked toward it without thinking. Not because she wanted to steal it. Not because she had a plan. Because her body was shutting down from 12 hours on her feet, and the rain was so cold it felt like needles, and the car was right there, and the rear passenger door was unlocked. She told herself 5 minutes. 5 minutes of warmth. 5 minutes of not being rained on. 5 minutes of sitting in something beautiful, even if it belonged to someone else, even if it was borrowed and stolen and wrong. She climbed in. The interior smelled like leather and whiskey, and something woody she couldn't name. Cedar, maybe, or sandalwood, something expensive and masculine that made her chest tighten for reasons she didn't want to examine. The seats were heated, still warm, like someone had been sitting here recently. Selene pulled her knees to her chest, wrapped her arms around herself, and closed her eyes. She was asleep in under 2 minutes. She didn't hear the driver's door open, didn't hear the engine start, didn't feel the car pull smoothly out of the lot and merge onto the rain-slicked highway. What woke her was the silence. The rain had stopped, or rather, the car had entered an underground garage where the rain couldn't reach. The engine was off. The only sound was the soft ticking of cooling metal and the steady, patient breathing of someone sitting in the driver's seat. Selene's eyes snapped open. A man was watching her in the rearview mirror. Not glancing, watching, the way a predator watches something it hasn't decided to kill yet. His eyes were the color of bourbon held up to firelight, dark amber with flecks of gold that caught the garage's fluorescent light and threw it back sharper. His jaw was cut from something harder than bone. Dark hair swept back from a face that was handsome, the way a loaded gun is handsome. Dangerous first, beautiful second. Selene stopped breathing. You sleep like someone who hasn't felt safe in a long time, he said. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to fill a room. It carried the faintest trace of an accent, Italian, maybe, worn down by years of American concrete. Celine's hand went for the door handle, locked. Child locks, he said without turning around. Relax. Let me out. It's still raining. I don't care. Let me out. He turned then, slowly, like a man who had never been rushed by anyone in his life. His shoulders were broad beneath a charcoal suit that fit like it had been sewn onto his body. No tie. Top button undone. A thin silver chain disappeared beneath his collar. His hands, large, scarred across the knuckles, rested on the steering wheel like they owned it, like they owned everything. You broke into my car, he said. Not angry. Amused. The kind of amusement that lived right next to something darker. The door was open. The door was unlocked. There's a difference. Is there? His mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Something closer to recognition, like she'd passed a test he hadn't told her about. You work at La Maison, he said. It wasn't a question. Selene said nothing. Section 4, corner tables. You carry the heavy trays with your left hand even though you're right-handed, which means your right shoulder is injured. Rotator cuff, probably. You don't complain about it because you can't afford to miss shifts. He paused. You also don't eat during service. Not because you're not hungry, because you're saving the staff meal to take home. The accuracy of it hit her like a slap. Who are you? She whispered. My name is Lucien Moretti. The name meant nothing to her, not yet. Lucien, she repeated, and hated how the syllables felt in her mouth, like heavy, warm, like swallowing something she'd regret. Great. Lucien, can you unlock the door now? Where do you live? That's none of your business. You're sitting in my car at midnight, soaking wet, with no vehicle of your own. I'm making it my business. I'll walk. It's 11 miles. She stared at him. How do you know that? He didn't answer, just watched her with those bourbon eyes that seemed to catalog every cracked piece of her and file them away for later use. I'll drive you home, he said. I don't get in cars with strangers. You're already in my car. That was an accident. Was it? The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Selene wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pressing down on her skull with both hands, and the seat was warm, and the rain outside the garage was picking up again, hammering the concrete ramp like it had a personal grudge against anyone stupid enough to be outside. Fine, she said. Drive. He started the engine without another word. The car was absurdly quiet, smooth, like riding inside a whispered threat. Selene gave him her address and pressed herself against the door, as far from him as the back seat allowed. They drove in silence for 3 blocks before he spoke again. How much do you owe? Excuse me? The car they took tonight. You owe on it. How much? How do you know they took... She stopped, shook her head. It doesn't matter. I'll figure it out. You've been figuring it out for 6 years. How's that working? The words were precise, surgical, delivered without cruelty but without softness either. He said them the way a doctor says the diagnosis, not to be mean, but because the truth doesn't care about your feelings. Selene's throat tightened. Pull over. We're on the highway. Then pull over on the highway. I want out. He didn't pull over. The car kept moving, gliding through the rain like a blade through silk. I'm not trying to insult you, he said. I'm trying to understand you. Why? Another long pause. The city light smeared across the windshield in streaks of gold and white. Because you walked into a $100,000 car, fell asleep like it was a park bench, and when you woke up trapped with a stranger, the first thing you did was fight. He glanced at her in the mirror. That's not normal. Maybe I'm just too tired to be scared. No, he said quietly. You're plenty scared. You're just more angry than you are afraid. That's rare. He pulled up to her building 12 minutes later. It was a squat brick walk-up with a fire escape that looked like it hadn't passed inspection since the 90s. One of the first-floor windows was covered in cardboard. The entryway light flickered with the desperate energy of something about to die. Lucien looked at the building the way most people look at a crime scene. Selene reached for the door. It clicked unlocked. Thank you for the ride, she said, and she meant it to sound dismissive, final, a door closing on a conversation that should never have happened. Selene, She froze. She had never told him her name. "Friday," he said. "I'll be at the restaurant. Section 4. It wasn't an invitation. It was a fact. Delivered with the quiet certainty of someone who had never been told no by anything that mattered. She got out of the car without answering. The rain hit her immediately, cold and mean, and by the time she reached her front door and turned around, the Aston Martin was gone. The street was empty. The only proof any of it had happened was the fading scent of cedarwood on her skin and the strange, hollow ache in her chest that felt like the first crack in a dam. She told herself she wouldn't think about him. She thought about him for 3 straight days. Friday came the way Fridays always came. Brutal. A double shift that started at 10 in the morning with brunch service and bled into dinner without mercy. Celine's shoulder screamed every time she lifted a tray. Her feet had gone numb around 4 o'clock. The restaurant was packed, loud, aggressively cheerful in the way only places that charge $40 for a salad can be. She was clearing table 12 when the front doors opened and the room changed. It didn't go quiet exactly. It was more like the air pressure shifted, the way it does before a tornado touches down. Conversations continued, but lower. Laughter became careful. The hostess, a 22-year-old named Bria, who was never nervous about anything, went pale behind the podium. Lucien Moretti walked in like he owned the floor he stood on. Charcoal suit, different from the one before but cut from the same philosophy. Nothing wasted, everything intentional. Behind him walked 2 men in dark jackets who were clearly not there to eat. They had the flat, scanning eyes of people whose job description included the word eliminate. They positioned themselves near the exits without being told to and stood with their hands folded in front of them, still as furniture. Lucien sat at his usual table. Section 4, corner. Her section. The manager, a thin man named Gerald, who sweated through his shirts on slow nights, materialized at Celine's elbow like a stress-induced hallucination. "That's Lucien Moretti," Gerald whispered, and the way he said the name, the reverence, the fear, the desperate need to not screw this up, told Selene everything the name itself hadn't. VIP? VIP doesn't cover it. His family practically owns the building this restaurant sits in. Whatever he wants, whenever he wants it, you say yes. You don't make him wait. You don't make mistakes. You don't make eye contact for too long. He's a person, Gerald, not a natural disaster. You sure about that? Gerald disappeared. Selene grabbed a water pitcher and walked over. Up close, without the darkness of the car and the rain blurring the edges, Lucien Moretti was harder to look at. Not uglier. Harder. His face was all angles and tension, like a building designed to withstand siege. There were faint scars along his jawline, barely visible beneath the clean shave, and his hands, those scarred, heavy hands, lay flat on the white tablecloth like weapons placed in plain sight as a courtesy. "Good evening," Selene said. Professional, detached. The voice of a woman who serves rich people for a living and has learned to become furniture. "Can I get you something to drink?" Lucien looked up at her, and the impact of those eyes at close range felt physical, like being shoved. "Macallan 18. Neat." Then quieter, just for her. "Your shoulder's worse." "My shoulder is fine." "You switched the tray to your right hand when you crossed the room. You never do that." "You've been here 30 seconds. I've been watching you for months." The statement landed between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. Celine's fingers tightened around the pitcher. "That's not charming," she said. "That's a restraining order." Something flickered behind his eyes. Not offense. Surprise, maybe. The faintest ghost of it, gone before she could be sure. "Macallan 18, he repeated. "Neat." She turned away before he could see her hand shaking. The next 3 hours were torture. Not because Lucien was rude, he wasn't. He was terrifyingly polite. He ordered food he barely touched, tipped the busboy who refilled his water glass $100 in cash, said please and thank you with the mechanical precision of someone who'd been taught manners the way soldiers are taught discipline. Not because it matters, but because it's useful. But every time Selene passed his table, she felt his gaze on her like a physical weight, a warm hand pressed between her shoulder blades, a heat source she couldn't get away from. At 11 o'clock, the restaurant emptied. Staff cleaned up around Lucien like he was a permanent fixture. Gerald hovered near the kitchen, too afraid to ask him to leave, too afraid to ignore him. The two men by the exits hadn't moved in 3 hours. Selene wasn't sure they'd blinked. She was wiping down the bar when Lucien appeared beside her. Close. Not touching, but close enough that she could smell him. That same cedar and whiskey scent that had haunted her all week, mixed with something else now. Something warmer. Skin. "Have a drink with me," he said. "I'm working." "You're wiping a clean counter for the 4th time." She stopped wiping, put the rag down, turned to face him. Up close, standing, he was taller than she'd realized. 6'2", maybe 6'3". He didn't crowd her, but he didn't give her space either. He occupied exactly the amount of room he wanted and left her to negotiate the rest. "One drink," he said. "Then I'll go." "Why?" "Because I want to talk to you. And I think you want to talk to me. And we can both pretend that's not true. Or we can skip the part where we lie to each other and go straight to the part where we're honest." Selene stared at him. The smart thing, the safe thing, the survival thing, was to say no. Every instinct she'd sharpened over 6 years of dodging landlords and creditors and handsy customers told her this man was trouble distilled into human form. The kind of trouble that didn't just ruin your life. It consumed it. But there was something else beneath the danger. Something in the way he looked at her that wasn't predatory exactly, but wasn't gentle either. It was hungry. Not for her body. Or not only for her body. Hungry for her attention. Her fight. The jagged, unpolished realness of her that everyone else overlooked. Nobody had ever looked at Selene Vale like she was worth studying. It was that, not the money, not the suit, not the car, that broke her. "One drink," she said. One drink became 2. 2 became a conversation that lasted until 1 in the morning, sitting across from each other in the empty restaurant with the lights dimmed and the rain starting up again outside. He asked her questions no one had ever asked. Not where she went to school or what her 5-year plan was. The polite, manufactured questions people use to fill silence. He asked her what she was afraid of. What made her angry. What she'd wanted to be before the world started telling her what she could afford to be. And she answered. Against every instinct, she answered. She told him about her mother dying when she was 18. About dropping out of college to pay the hospital bills that kept arriving like aftershocks. About the apartments that got smaller each year, the jobs that got harder, the slow erosion of dignity that comes from being poor in a city that worships wealth. She told him she used to paint. That one slipped out. She hadn't meant to say it, hadn't thought about it in years. But the whiskey was warm in her stomach and his eyes were steady on hers, and the confession came out like a splinter working its way to the surface. "Watercolors," she said. "I was good. Not great, but good enough that my professor told me I had something. And then my mom got sick and good enough stopped mattering." Lucien said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Do you still have them? The paintings?" "No. I sold them. The last ones. 2 years ago. $120 for 6 canvases. Rent was due." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. "I don't need your pity," she said, and the steel in her voice was genuine, forged in years of swallowing grief and walking upright anyway. "I know," he said. "That's not what I'm offering." "What are you offering?" He held her gaze. The amber burned darker now, molten, like something was being forged behind his eyes that she wasn't ready to see. "I'll tell you when I know," he said. It should have been the end. That line, enigmatic, evasive, designed to leave her wanting more, should have triggered every alarm in her system. And it did. Every alarm fired, every red flag unfurled. She went home with him anyway. Not to his home, not that night. But she let him drive her again. Let his coat settle around her shoulders when they walked to the car. Let the silence between them fill with something electric and terrifying that she refused to name. At her door, he didn't try to kiss her, didn't touch her, just stood in the rain, getting soaked, ruining that perfect suit, and watched her unlock the door with hands that weren't quite steady. "Selene," she looked back. "I'm not a good man," he said, simply, without drama, like he was telling her his blood type. "I need you to know that before whatever this is goes any further." "I've never been interested in good men," she said. "Good men have never been interested in me." Something shifted in his face, a crack in the stone. Just for a second, a flash of something that looked almost like pain. And then it was gone, and the mask was back. and Lucien Moretti stood in the rain looking like a monument to everything she should run from. "Good night," he said. "Good night." She closed the door, leaned against it, pressed her forehead to the cold wood, and breathed. "What are you doing?" she thought. "What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing?" She didn't have an answer. She still went back. The weeks that followed moved with the strange velocity of a fever dream. Lucien came to the restaurant every Friday without fail. Same table, same guards, same quiet, devastating attention that made Selene feel like the only person in a room full of people who didn't matter. But it wasn't just Fridays anymore. He texted her at 2 in the morning. Short, blunt messages that read less like flirtation and more like reconnaissance. "What did you eat today? How's the shoulder? Are you home?" She hated how much she liked it. He sent a physical therapist to her apartment for the shoulder. She didn't ask him to, didn't want him to. Told the woman to leave, then called Lucien and shouted at him for 15 minutes while he listened in what she would later realize was amused silence. "I don't need you to fix me," she snapped. "I know, but you need your shoulder to work, and you're too stubborn to fix it yourself." "That's my choice." "Yes, and this is mine." She let the therapist come back, hated herself for it, hated him more, hated most of all how good it felt when the pain started to recede and she could lift a tray without her vision blurring. The night everything changed started like every other Friday. Dinner service, chaos, Lucien in his corner. But at closing, instead of walking to the bar, he stood at her section and said, "Come with me." Not a question, not a request. She should have said no. "Where?" "Somewhere I can hear you talk without a kitchen behind you." She went. His penthouse was on the 47th floor of a building that didn't have a name on the outside. No signage, no doorman, just a parking garage that required 3 separate credentials to enter and an elevator that opened with a fingerprint scan. The apartment itself was enormous and cold, all glass walls and concrete floors and art that looked like it cost more than her entire life. A city of lights stretched below them in every direction, glittering and indifferent. "This is where you live?" she asked. "This is where I sleep." "There's a difference." She turned to face him. He was leaning against the kitchen counter, jacket off, sleeves rolled to his forearms. The scars on his knuckles were more visible here, in the apartment's clinical light. And there were others she hadn't noticed before. A thin white line that ran from the base of his right ear to his collarbone. A puckered mark on the inside of his left forearm that looked like it had been made by something that burned. "Those scars," she said. "Ask me next time. What makes you think there'll be a next time?" He didn't answer, just crossed the room toward her with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who is done being patient. He stopped close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his body, close enough that his breath grazed her forehead. "Tell me to stop," he said. She didn't. The kiss wasn't gentle, wasn't careful. It was desperate and rough, and tasted like whiskey and the copper tang of bitten lips. His hands found her waist like they'd memorized the shape of her from across the room. Her fingers dug into the muscles of his shoulders and felt them tighten under her grip. He kissed like a man who'd been starving for something specific and had finally found it, all precision and hunger and barely leashed violence. They didn't make it to the bedroom the first time. The couch, then the floor, then the bedroom, eventually, where the sheets were cold until they weren't. Selene woke at 4 a.m. in a bed that was too soft, wrapped in sheets that smelled like cedar, with a man whose arm was draped across her stomach like a barricade. She lay there in the dark and stared at the ceiling, listening to Lucien breathe. "What have I done?" she thought. But beneath the fear, beneath the warning bells still ringing in the back of her skull, there was something else. Something warm and dangerous and unfamiliar. She felt seen. For the first time in 6 years, someone had looked at her, really looked, and hadn't flinched at what they found. It was the most terrifying feeling she'd ever known. She stayed through the weekend. That was her first mistake. The second came Sunday morning when she walked out of the bathroom and found Lucien on the phone. His voice was different, colder, flatter, scraped clean of everything warm he'd shown her. He was speaking in rapid Italian, and even without understanding the words, Selene could hear the threat in them. The authority. Whatever he was saying, someone on the other end was afraid. He hung up when he saw her. The transformation was instant. The ice melted, the hardness softened, and he was Lucien again, The man who'd kissed her shoulder at 3 in the morning and whispered things against her skin that she'd pretend not to remember. Who was that? She asked. Business? What kind of business requires phone calls at 6 in the morning that sound like threats? His jaw tightened, just a flicker. The kind that keeps the lights on. That's not an answer. I know. He walked toward her, cupped her face in those scarred hands, kissed her forehead with a gentleness that contradicted everything she'd just heard. I told you I'm not a good man, he said. And I told you I wasn't interested in good men. But I'm also not interested in being lied to. Something moved behind his eyes, a calculation, a weighing of costs. Get dressed, he said. There's something I need to show you. He drove her to a building downtown. 12 stories, no windows on the first 3 floors. Men in dark suits stood at every entrance, and when Lucien walked through the front door, every single one of them straightened. Some nodded. None smiled. They looked at Selene with expressions that ranged from curiosity to suspicion to something she couldn't read but felt in her gut like a warning. Lucien led her to an office on the top floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, a mahogany desk that looked like it weighed more than her car, her former car. On the wall behind it, framed photographs. Men in suits spanning decades, each one with the same hard jaw, the same sharp eyes. And in the center, larger than the rest, a photograph of an older man with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Beneath it, engraved in a brass plate, Salvatore Moretti. My father, Lucien said. He stood beside her, hands in his pockets, watching her face the way a man watches a jury during a verdict. He built this organization 40 years ago. By next Saturday, he retires, and everything he built passes to me. Selene looked at the photographs, looked at the armed men, looked at Lucien, standing in the middle of it all like a king who'd been born for a throne he didn't fully want. Organization, she repeated. That's what you're calling it? It's the polite word. And the impolite one? He held her gaze, didn't blink. Empire. The word sat between them like a loaded weapon. Selene's legs went cold. Her vision sharpened the way it does when the body senses danger before the mind catches up. She thought about the guards, the phone calls, the scars, the way Gerald had said his name like a prayer aimed at something he was afraid of. You're... Yes. She stepped back. One step, then another. Take me home. Selene, take me home, Lucien. Now. He drove her home in silence. She didn't speak, didn't look at him. Sat in the back seat with her arms wrapped around herself, rebuilding every wall he'd spent weeks dismantling. At her door, she got out without a word. I'm not going to disappear, he called after her. She slammed the door, locked it, slid to the floor, and pressed her back against the wood and tried to breathe. 2 days later, she found the envelope. It was slid under her door sometime before dawn, plain white. No name. Inside, a single sheet of paper with the logo of a medical laboratory she'd never heard of. A blood test. Her blood test. Results dated from 2 days ago. A sample she didn't remember giving, and a single word circled in red ink at the bottom of the page. Positive. Selene stared at the paper until the letters blurred. Her hands trembled so badly the sheet rattled like something alive. Her phone rang. She already knew who it was. We need to talk, Lucien said. And the rain began again. She didn't call him back. She sat on the bathroom floor with the blood test results in her lap and stared at the cracked tile between her feet until the morning light turned the room gray, then gold, then white. The phone rang 4 times. 5. 6. She counted each one the way you count the seconds between lightning and thunder, measuring how close the danger is, calculating whether you still have time to run. On the 7th call, she threw the phone against the wall. The screen cracked. The ringing stopped. And for about 90 seconds, Selene Vale experienced something that felt almost like silence. Then she threw up. Not because of the pregnancy. Not yet. It was too early for that. But because her body understood what her brain was still refusing to process. Someone had taken her blood while she slept. Someone had run a test she never consented to. Someone had slid the results under her door like a receipt for something she'd already been charged for. And that someone was the heir to a criminal empire who had just told her he wasn't a good man, like that was supposed to be enough of a warning. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, stood up, looked at herself in the mirror, smudged mascara, bloodshot eyes, hair matted against her skull from a night spent on cold tile. She looked like a woman who'd been in a car wreck, which, in a sense, she had. The knock came at 11. Not a polite knock, not a friendly knock. The kind of knock that says the person on the other side has been patient long enough, and patience is a resource they're running low on. Selene didn't move. "I know you're in there," Lucien's voice came through the door, low, controlled, but there was something beneath the control now, a tightness, like a wire about to snap. "I've had someone watching the building since last night." "Of course you have," she said from the couch. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. The walls in this apartment were thin enough that she could hear her neighbor sneeze, so a man standing 3 feet away could certainly hear her contempt. "Open the door, Selene." "No." A pause. She heard him shift his weight, heard the creak of leather, his jacket, his shoes, everything about him wrapped in dead animal skin and money. "I can have this door off its hinges in 4 seconds, and I can have the police here in 3 minutes." "The police?" Something between a laugh and a cough. "You think the police are going to help you with me?" She got up, walked to the door, pressed her palm flat against the wood and felt the vibration of his presence on the other side. Heat, mass, the gravitational pull of a man who bent everything around him into orbit. "You took my blood," she said. Silence. "While I was asleep, in your bed, you stuck a needle in my arm and ran a pregnancy test without my knowledge, without my consent." More silence. Then, "Yes." The honesty was worse than a lie would have been. A lie she could have fought. The truth just sat there, ugly and immovable, daring her to do something about it. "Why?" "Because I needed to know." That's not a reason. That's an excuse. "It's the truth. You don't have to like it." Selene's forehead touched the door. She could feel the paint peeling under her skin, the cheap latex bubbling away from wood that was probably rotting underneath. This whole apartment was rotting. This whole life was rotting. And the man on the other side of the door was offering her something that looked like rescue but felt like a different kind of cage. She opened the door. Lucien stood in the hallway looking like he hadn't slept either, which on him meant he looked slightly less perfect than usual. His shirt was wrinkled at the collar. His jaw carried a shadow of stubble that darkened the scars along his jawline. His eyes, those amber predator eyes, were shot through with red. He looked at her. She looked at him. The hallway smelled like mildew and cooking grease from the apartment downstairs. "You had no right," she said. "I know." "You violated—" "I know." "Stop saying you know. If you knew, you wouldn't have done it." He stepped toward her. She stepped back. He stopped. "I would have done it anyway," he said. And the terrible thing was the steadiness of his voice. No guilt, no apology, just the flat certainty of a man who had calculated the cost of his actions and decided he could afford them. "I needed to know if you were carrying my child. I wasn't willing to wait for you to find out on your own and decide without me." "Decide what?" "Anything." The word hit her like a closed fist. "Get out!" "Selene, get out of my apartment, Lucien. Get out of my building. Get out of whatever fantasy you've constructed where this—" She gestured between them at the air itself, at everything wrong and tangled and burning, "is something I signed up for." He didn't move. His hands hung at his sides, loose, but she noticed the tendons in his forearms were tight as bridge cables. A man restraining himself, from what, she wasn't sure. "You didn't sign up for it," he said. "Neither did I. But it's here. The test is real. The result is real. And what we do next matters more than how we got here." "What we do next?" She laughed. It sounded like glass breaking. "There is no we. There's you, the guy who had my blood drawn while I was unconscious. And there's me, the idiot who slept with a stranger because he looked at her like she was worth something. Those are 2 separate people with 2 separate problems." Something flickered across his face. Fast. Gone before she could name it. But she saw it. A flinch, buried deep beneath the concrete mask, visible only because she'd spent the last few weeks learning the geography of his expressions. She'd hurt him. "Good. I'm going to ask you something," he said, and I need you to answer honestly. You don't get to ask me anything. Are you keeping it? The question landed in the room and everything else went quiet. The traffic outside, the neighbor's television, the drip from the kitchen faucet that had been driving her insane for months. All of it just stopped. Selene opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I don't know, she whispered. Lucien exhaled. Not a sigh. Something heavier. Something that carried the weight of bloodlines and dynasties and all the brutal arithmetic of a family that counted power the way normal people count calories. When you know, he said, call me. He turned to leave. Made it 2 steps before she spoke. And if I don't keep it? What happens then? You disappear? I go back to carrying trays and pretending I never met you? He stopped. Didn't turn around. If you don't keep it, he said to the hallway wall, I will respect your decision, and I will spend the rest of my life wondering what would have been. Then he walked away. His footsteps echoed down the stairwell, steady, measured, unhurried, until the front door opened and closed, and he was gone. Selene stood in her doorway for a long time after that. The blood test results were still on the bathroom floor. The phone was still cracked against the wall, and inside her, something that was either a future or a catastrophe was quietly, invisibly beginning. She bought a pregnancy test at the pharmacy on the corner. Then she bought 2 more, because she didn't trust the first one. And she didn't trust Lucien's lab results. And she didn't trust her own body, which had apparently decided to betray her without sending so much as a memo. All 3 tests came back positive. She sat on the toilet lid and stared at the 3 plastic sticks lined up on the edge of the sink like tiny white verdicts. And she felt the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from running out of things to deny. 3 days passed. She worked her shifts, smiled at customers, carried trays, kept her shoulders straight and her face blank, and her mind as empty as she could manage, which wasn't very. At night, she lay in bed and put her hand flat against her stomach and tried to feel something, connection, terror, love, anything, and felt only the absence of a decision she wasn't ready to make. On the 4th day, a car arrived. Not the Aston Martin. A black SUV with tinted windows, driven by a man whose neck was thicker than Selene's thigh. He handed her an envelope through the passenger window while she stood on the sidewalk in her work clothes. Inside the envelope, a single card, cream-colored, thick stock, embossed gold lettering. You are cordially invited to the estate of Salvatore Moretti for an evening of celebration. Saturday, 7 p.m., formal attire. Below it, in handwriting she recognized, sharp, angular, impatient, Lucien had written, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to see what you're deciding about. She should have torn it up. She should have tossed it in the trash and blocked his number and moved on with her life the way she'd moved on from everything else. Through sheer, stubborn, joyless endurance. Instead, she went shopping. The dress was black because she couldn't afford anything else, and because black felt like armor. She found it at a consignment shop for $47. Simple, floor length, cut close enough to suggest a body without advertising it. She borrowed shoes from a coworker who didn't ask questions. Did her own makeup in the bathroom mirror with hands that only shook a little. When the SUV returned on Saturday evening, Selene climbed in and didn't look back at her apartment. Some part of her understood that if she looked back, she'd lose her nerve. And Selene Vale had survived 24 years on this planet by never, ever losing her nerve. The Moretti estate sat 40 minutes outside the city, up a private road lined with trees so old and thick they formed a canopy that blotted out the sky. Iron gates opened as the SUV approached. Security cameras tracked them from the tree line. Men with earpieces and holstered weapons materialized from the shadows, checked the driver's credentials, and waved them through. The mansion appeared through the trees like something from a different century. Stone walls, columns, windows that blazed with golden light. Cars lined the circular driveway, Maseratis, Bentleys, vehicles that cost more than houses. And the men and women emerging from them wore clothes that Selene's consignment shop dress couldn't compete with on its best day. She almost told the driver to turn around. Then the front door opened and Lucien walked out. He was wearing a black tuxedo, and the effect was devastating in the clinical, surgical way a scalpel is devastating. Precise, elegant, designed to cut. His hair was swept back from his face. His jaw was clean. And when he saw her stepping out of the SUV, something happened to his expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. It broke, not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but the mask, that careful, polished, bulletproof mask he wore like a second face, cracked open for exactly 1 second, and underneath it she saw hunger and relief and something that looked terrifyingly close to need. Then it was gone. The mask reassembled. He extended his hand. "You came," he said. "Don't make me regret it." He led her inside, and the world she entered bore no resemblance to any world she'd known. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with scenes she didn't recognize. Marble floors reflected the light of 100 candles. Men in suits that cost 5 figures shook hands with men whose faces she'd seen on the evening news. Women in diamonds laughed with their mouths, but not their eyes. And through it all moved a current of tension so thick Selene could taste it, metallic, electric, like the air before a storm. People noticed her immediately, not because of the dress, because of whose arm she was on. The whispers started before they'd crossed the foyer. She caught fragments. Who is she? Where did he find her? The waitress, I heard. Nobody. Nothing. And each one landed like a small, sharp stone thrown at the back of her skull. Lucien's hand tightened on the small of her back. A warning or a comfort, she couldn't tell which. "Ignore them," he murmured. "Easy for you to say." "No, it isn't." Before she could respond, a voice cut through the noise. "So this is her." The crowd parted. Not gradually. Immediately. Like a school of fish sensing a shark. Salvatore Moretti stood at the base of the grand staircase with a glass of red wine in one hand and the quiet authority of a man who had been feared for 4 decades written into every line of his face. He was shorter than Lucien, older, thinner, but the power emanating from him was not diminished by age, Rust. It was concentrated by it, distilled into something dense and absolute. His eyes were not amber like Lucien's. They were black, the kind of black that swallows light and gives nothing back. He studied Selene the way a jeweler studies a stone, turning her over in his mind, checking for flaws, calculating worth. "Come here," Salvatore said. Lucien's body went rigid beside her. A subtle thing, the slight squaring of his shoulders, the barely perceptible shift of weight toward his left foot, where she suspected something was holstered beneath his jacket. Selene walked forward. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the same impulse that had driven her into Lucien's car that night in the rain. The reckless, exhaustion-born courage of a woman who has lost so much that fear starts to feel redundant. She stopped 3 feet from Salvatore Moretti and looked him in the eye. "You're smaller than I expected," she said. The room went absolutely silent. Then Salvatore laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was the laugh of a man testing a blade's edge against his thumb. But it was real, and the tension in the room dropped by exactly 1 degree. "She has spine," Salvatore said to Lucien, who had materialized at Selene's shoulder like a shadow that refused to be separated from its source. "Where did you find her?" "She found me," Lucien said. "Did she?" Salvatore sipped his wine. His black eyes never left Selene's face. "And what do you do, girl?" "I'm a waitress." "A waitress?" He said the word like he was tasting something unfamiliar. "And you think you belong here?" "I think I belong wherever I decide to stand." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either an execution or an alliance. Salvatore held it for 3 full seconds, an eternity in a room full of people who measured power by who blinked first. "She's either your greatest strength," Salvatore said to Lucien, his voice dropping to something only the 3 of them could hear, "or the knife that opens this family up for everyone to reach inside." He walked away without waiting for a response. The crowd closed behind him like water filling a wound. Lucien's hand found Selene's waist again. His fingers were trembling. She'd never felt him tremble before, and the sensation, that tiny, hidden fracture in his control, scared her more than anything Salvatore had said. "What did he mean?" she whispered. "He means the family knows about the baby." Her stomach dropped. "How?" "Because I told him. Before I told you, before the test. I told him the moment I suspected." She pulled away from his hand. "You told your father I might be pregnant before you told me?" "Yes." "Why?" His jaw worked. She watched the muscle jump beneath the scar tissue. Because in this family, a pregnancy isn't personal, it's political. An heir changes the line of succession. It changes alliances. It changes who is loyal and who starts making other plans. I'm not a political event, Lucien. I'm a person. I know that. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you treated me like an asset, something to be managed, reported on. I was trying to protect you. By going behind my back? By making sure my father heard it from me before he heard it from someone with a reason to use it against us. The word us landed between them, and Selene didn't pick it up. She let it lie there on the marble floor between their feet, unclaimed, while the party swirled around them and the chandeliers cast everything in gold that felt counterfeit. I need air, she said. She found the gardens through a set of French doors at the back of the estate. The night air was cool and smelled like wet grass and the distant salt of the harbor. Hedgerows lined stone pathways that wound through manicured darkness. Fountains murmured. Somewhere beyond the garden wall, she could hear the low voices of security detail making their rounds. She walked alone. Not because Lucien let her. She saw the argument flicker behind his eyes when she turned away, but because he was summoned at the same moment by a cluster of men in suits who needed the future king's attention more than the future king needed his conscience. Selene walked deep into the garden, past the hedgerows, past the fountains, until the noise of the party was just a distant hum, and the only light came from the half-moon hanging above the tree line, like a witness too tired to intervene. She stopped at a stone bench near the outermost wall, sat down, put her face in her hands. She was 24 years old. She was pregnant by a man who ran a criminal empire. She was sitting in the garden of a mansion owned by a kingpin who had just evaluated her like livestock. She had $43 in her checking account, a cracked phone, an address that cost less than the appetizers being served inside. And somehow, despite all of it, the thing that hurt the most was the trembling in Lucien's fingers, the crack in his mask, the tiny, devastating evidence that beneath everything, the money, the power, the violence, there was a man who was afraid of losing her, which meant he could be hurt, which meant she could hurt him, which meant this was real. She heard the snap before she felt the impact. A sound like a branch breaking, except sharper, metallic, followed instantaneously by an explosion of stone and water 6 inches from her face. The fountain beside the bench erupted. Shards of marble sprayed across her arms, her neck, her hair. Water, cold, shocking, drenched her left side. Selene didn't scream, didn't even flinch, which would bother her later when she had time to process the fact that her survival instincts were either remarkably good or profoundly broken. She threw herself off the bench and hit the ground behind a stone planter, pressing her body flat against the grass, her cheek in the dirt, her hands over her stomach. Her stomach. She was covering her stomach. An instinct she didn't know she had, protecting something she hadn't decided to keep. The second shot hit the wall above her head. Chips of stone rained down on her back. Then everything happened at once. Shouts erupted from the perimeter. Flashlights sliced through the garden. The heavy rhythmic crack of return fire echoed off the stone walls, and men in dark suits swarmed the grounds like a disturbed hive. Someone was screaming orders in Italian. Someone else was screaming in a language she didn't recognize. And then Lucien was there. He materialized out of the darkness like something conjured from it, jacket off, weapon drawn, his body slamming over hers before she could process that he'd moved at all. His weight crushed her into the grass. His arm caged her head. She could feel his heart hammering against her spine, impossibly fast, the rhythm of a man whose body had been flooded with so much adrenaline that his blood was essentially gasoline. "Don't move," he breathed against her hair. "Don't move, don't move, don't move." She didn't move. The gunfire lasted 90 seconds. It felt like 90 years. When it stopped, the silence that followed was the worst sound Selene had ever heard. A silence that meant something was over, but gave no indication of what. Lucien lifted his weight off her slowly. His hand found her face in the dark. His fingers traced her jaw, her cheekbone, the bridge of her nose, checking for blood with the methodical desperation of a man performing triage on the thing he valued most. "Are you hit?" "No." "The baby." "I'm fine." "Lucien." "I'm fine." He exhaled. A ragged, shattered sound. Then his arms closed around her and he pulled her against his chest and held her with a force that bordered on pain. She could feel the gun still in his right hand, pressing against her shoulder blade, still warm from firing. 3 men down, someone reported from the darkness. Professional, clinical. Shooters gone. West wall breach. We've locked the perimeter. Lucien's arms didn't loosen. Who? He asked. One word. Delivered with the flat calm of a man who had already moved past shock and into the territory beyond it, the cold mechanical place where rage becomes strategy. Don't know yet. We're pulling surveillance. Lucien's mouth was at her ear. She could feel his breath, hot, uneven, stripped of every pretense she'd ever seen him wear. I told you, he whispered. I told you no one touches what belongs to me. Selene pulled back, looked at him. His face was streaked with dirt and something darker. Blood, maybe, from a cut along his hairline. His eyes were no longer amber, they were black. All pupil, all darkness, every trace of warmth incinerated by whatever had ignited inside him when the first bullet hit. She reached up, touched his face. Her fingers came back red. You're bleeding, she said. It doesn't matter. It matters to me. Something cracked behind his eyes. Not the mask this time. Something deeper. Something structural. The foundation beneath the facade shifting under a weight it wasn't built to carry. He pressed his forehead against hers, closed his eyes. And for 1 second, one raw, unguarded second, Lucien Moretti wasn't a future king or a dangerous heir or a man who ran an empire built on violence. He was just a man who was terrified of losing the only thing he'd ever wanted to keep. Then the second passed. His eyes opened. The blackness receded. And what replaced it was something far more dangerous than fear, purpose. He stood, extended his hand, pulled her to her feet. We're leaving, he said. Lucien, now. He walked her through the ruined garden, past the shattered fountain, past the 3 bodies covered in dark jackets that no one had moved yet. Security swarmed around them. Someone draped a blanket over Selene's shoulders. Someone else handed Lucien a phone that was already ringing. As they reached the driveway, she looked back at the mansion one last time. Golden light still poured from every window. The party was still going, music still played. Behind those walls, politicians and criminals and power brokers were finishing their drinks and pretending nothing had happened. Because in this world, nothing had. 3 dead guards was a cost of business. A sniper in the garden was an inconvenience. And a pregnant woman covered in stone dust and someone else's blood was just another variable in an equation that had been running for 40 years. Lucien helped her into the armored SUV, climbed in beside her, slammed the door. The engine started and the estate shrank in the rearview mirror, swallowed by darkness and distance and the terrible understanding that was settling over Selene like a second skin. She looked down at her hands. They were dirty, scraped, trembling. But beneath the trembling, pressed flat against her stomach without conscious thought, they were steady. She was protecting it. She was protecting the baby. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Not a decision she'd made. A decision her body had made for her, in the dark, under gunfire, without consulting her brain or her fear or her common sense. She looked at Lucien. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw locked, his hand resting on the weapon in his lap, his mind clearly already 3 moves deep into a game she couldn't see. Someone inside your family did this, she said. Not a question. His eyes shifted to her. Yes. Someone who knows about me. About the baby. Yes. And this is the world you want to bring a child into. He was quiet for a long time. The highway lights strobed across his face in rhythmic pulses. Light, dark, light, dark. Like the visual equivalent of a heartbeat. This is the world that exists, he said finally, whether I want it or not. Selene leaned her head against the bulletproof glass and closed her eyes. Her old life was gone. She understood that now with a clarity that felt like bone setting after a break. Painful, necessary, irreversible. There was no going back to the apartment with the peeling wallpaper and the dripping faucet and the safe, small, suffocating prison of her poverty. That woman, the one who carried trays and counted tips and painted watercolors she sold for grocery money, that woman died in a garden 15 minutes ago, face down in the grass with her hands over a future she hadn't chosen. Whatever crawled out of that grass was someone new, someone who had to decide right now, tonight, whether she was going to run from this war or stand inside it. She opened her eyes. looked at Lucien's profile. The cut on his hairline had stopped bleeding, but the blood had dried in a dark line down his temple, and he hadn't wiped it away, and she understood that he wouldn't, that he would wear it like evidence until the person who put it there was found. "I'm not going back to my apartment," she said. He turned to her. Something moved behind his eyes, hope, maybe, or its more dangerous cousin. "Where do you want to go?" Selene put her hand on her stomach, felt the warmth of her own skin, imagined, beneath it, the microscopic beginning of something that would either save her or destroy her. "Wherever you're going," she said, "but I swear to you, Lucien, Pulsit, if you ever go behind my back again, if you ever make a decision about my body or my life without telling me first, I will burn your empire down myself, and I won't need a gun to do it." The ghost of something, not a smile, not quite, but the architecture of one, crossed his face. "I believe you," he said. The SUV accelerated into the night. Behind them, the Moretti estate glowed against the horizon like a burning crown. And somewhere inside its walls, someone was already making a phone call, reporting that the bullet had missed, planning the next one. The penthouse became a cage with a view. 47 floors above a city that didn't know it was at war, Selene Vale sat cross-legged on a couch that cost more than her annual salary and watched Lucien Moretti dismantle his own world one phone call at a time. 3 days since the garden. 3 days since the bullet missed her face by 6 inches. 3 days since she'd made the decision to stay, not out of love, not out of courage, but out of the grim animal understanding that running was no longer an option. Whoever had pulled that trigger knew her face, knew her name, knew what was growing inside her. Running wouldn't save her. It would just mean dying tired. So she stayed. And the cage tightened. Lucien had tripled the security. 4 men in the hallway, 2 in the lobby. Cameras on every floor, every stairwell, every elevator. The windows, floor-to-ceiling glass that had once made the apartment feel like floating, were now fitted with ballistic film that turned the city below into something slightly blurred, slightly distorted, like looking at the world through a bruise. He slept beside her every night and was gone by 5 every morning. When he left, he locked the door from the outside. Not with a key, with a code, changed daily, that only he and his head of security knew. Selene had asked for the code once. Lucien had looked at her with an expression that was equal parts apology and iron. "Not yet," he'd said. "When? When I know who's trying to kill you." That was day 1. By day 3, Selene had memorized the shift changes of every guard. She knew that the man named Enzo took his coffee break at 2:15 p.m. and left his post for exactly 4 minutes. She knew the building's service elevator required a key card, but not a code, and that the maintenance staff entered through the parking garage using a side door that the cameras covered only partially. She cataloged this information without conscious intent, the way a prisoner maps the routines of the guards, not planning escape, just keeping the option alive. Because Selene Vale had spent her entire life in situations she couldn't control, and the one skill she'd perfected was knowing where every exit was, even when she couldn't use them. On the 4th morning, everything shifted. She woke to the sound of Lucien's voice, not the low, intimate register he used with her, but the other one, the one that sounded like concrete grinding against concrete. He was in the living room, pacing. She could hear his footsteps through the bedroom door, heavy, irregular, the rhythm of a man whose body was trying to outrun his thoughts. "Say that again," he said. A pause. Someone speaking through the phone. Selene pressed her ear against the door. "How long?" Not a question. A demand. "How long has he been in contact with them?" Another pause. Longer this time. Lucien's pacing stopped. The silence that followed was the most terrifying sound Selene had heard since the gunshots. The silence of a man processing information that was rearranging everything he thought he knew. "Bring me everything," Lucien said. His voice had dropped to a frequency she'd never heard from him. Below anger, below cold, somewhere in the basement of human emotion where the only things that survive are instinct and intent. Every message, every transfer, every meeting, I want it on my desk in 2 hours. And Marco, nobody moves on this until I say. Nobody. If I find out someone tipped him before I'm ready, I will hold you personally responsible. And you know what that means." He hung up. Selene heard him exhale, a long, controlled breath, the kind a man takes when he's trying to keep something inside his chest from detonating. She opened the bedroom door. Lucien was standing at the window with his back to her. His shirt was untucked. His feet were bare. One hand hung at his side. The other was pressed flat against the glass, fingers spread, like he was trying to hold the city in place. "Who is it?" she asked. He didn't turn around. "You shouldn't have heard that." "But I did. Who is it?" Silence. The city below them pulsed with morning traffic. Cars the size of insects crawling through arteries of asphalt, oblivious to the man 47 floors above them who was about to tear an empire apart. "Adrian," Lucien said. The name landed in the room like a dropped blade. "Your cousin," Selene said. She'd met Adrian briefly at the estate, a handsome man in his early 30s with green eyes and an easy smile and the kind of charm that felt rehearsed. He'd kissed her hand when Lucien introduced them, called her Bella, told Lucien he was a lucky man. She'd disliked him instantly, in the specific, instinctive way you dislike something that moves too smoothly. "My cousin," Lucien confirmed. "My father's brother's son. We grew up in the same house, trained under the same teachers. He stood next to me at every family meeting since we were 14 years old." A pause. "He's been feeding information to the Petrov syndicate for 8 months. Selene felt the blood leave her face. She knew the name Petrov only from fragments, overheard conversations, the tense way Lucien's men said it, the single time she'd seen the name in a headline on Gerald's phone at the restaurant with the word massacre beside it. 8 months, she repeated. 8 months! Since before my father announced the transition. Since before I met you. Adrian has been meeting with Yuri Petrov's people in a warehouse on the docks, trading operational details, shipment routes, security rotations, financial accounts, in exchange for a guarantee. What guarantee? Lucien turned. His face was calm in the way a frozen lake is calm, still on top, with something enormous moving underneath. That when the time comes, the Petrovs will help him take the throne, my throne. They eliminate me. They eliminate anyone loyal to me, and Adrian steps in as the new head of the family with Petrov backing. Clean transition, minimal disruption to business. And the baby? The question came out before she could stop it, and the way Lucien's expression changed when she said it, the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes, the way his nostrils flared on the inhale, told her everything. The baby is leverage, he said, or collateral damage, depending on how generous Adrian is feeling when the moment comes. Selene sat down. Not gracefully. Her legs simply stopped working and the couch caught her. She put her hands on her knees and pressed down hard, using the pressure to anchor herself, to keep her body from doing what her mind wanted to do, which was dissolve into the kind of panic that serves no one and saves nothing. What are you going to do? She asked. What I have to. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. He crossed the room, knelt in front of her. His hands covered hers on her knees, warm, rough, scarred. She could feel the tension in his fingers, the barely contained tremor of a man holding back an avalanche with his bare hands. I need you to trust me, he said. You locked me in an apartment, and you're asking me to trust you. The blow landed. She saw it register. A flicker in his jaw, a tightening in his grip. I know what it looks like, he said. I know what it feels like. But there are people in this city right now who would use you to get to me, and the only way I can fight them is if I know you're safe. Safe. She almost laughed. I'm a prisoner, Lucien, a comfortable prisoner with heated floors and a view, but a prisoner. You want to know the difference between you and the life I had before? At least when I was broke and exhausted, I could walk out my own front door. He closed his eyes. She watched the muscles in his face work, the effort of absorbing a truth he couldn't argue with, because it was true. 3 days, he said. Give me 3 days to deal with Adrian. Then the code is yours. The door is open. You stay or you go. Your choice. And if in 3 days I'm dead, then I'll already be dead, because they'll have to go through me first. He said it without drama, without bravado. The way you say something that has been true for so long, it doesn't need emphasis. Selene looked at him for a long time, at the circles under his eyes, at the cut on his hairline that had scabbed over but not healed, at the hands that could end a life and were currently cradling hers like she was made of something he was afraid to break. 3 days, she said. He left within the hour. The door locked behind him. The code beeped. The apartment settled into its particular brand of silence, the kind that comes with altitude and wealth and the absence of any sound that matters. Selene waited until Lucien's footsteps faded from the hallway. Then she went to work. She'd been listening. For days she'd been listening, not just to Lucien's phone calls, but to the guards' conversations, to the fragments that drifted through the apartment's thin points. The bathroom vent, which connected to the building's central air system, carried voices from the security station 2 floors below if you pressed your ear against the metal grate and held your breath. The bedroom window, cracked open half an inch for air, picked up radio chatter from the rooftop team when the wind blew south. And what she'd heard, piece by piece, conversation by conversation, was a picture that didn't match the one Lucien had just painted. She'd heard Marco, Lucien's head of security, on the phone 3 nights ago, speaking in hushed Italian that she'd partially deciphered using a translation app on the tablet Lucien had left her. Most of it was operational noise, security rotations, shift changes. But one phrase had stuck with her, repeating in her mind like a stone in a shoe. La cerimonia è sabato. Adrian sarà lì. Tutti saranno lì. The ceremony is Saturday. Adrian will be there. Everyone will be there. And then, quieter, barely audible through the vent, Se lo facciamo lì, nessuno potrà dire di no. If we do it there, no one will be able to say no. Lucien's coronation ceremony, the formal event where Salvatore would officially transfer power to his son. She'd heard it discussed in passing, a gathering of the entire syndicate, every captain, every lieutenant, every ally. The kind of event that happened once in a generation. And Adrian knew about it. Of course he knew about it. He was family. He'd be there. Which meant if Adrian was planning to move against Lucien, the ceremony was the obvious moment. Maximum audience. Maximum impact. Remove the air in front of the entire organization, and there's no ambiguity, no disputed succession, no loyalists who can claim they didn't see it happen. But there was something else. Something that didn't fit. If Lucien's people had discovered Adrian's betrayal, if they had 8 months of evidence, messages, transfers, meetings, why wait? Why give Adrian 3 more days to prepare? Why let him walk into a room full of armed men who already knew he was a traitor and trust that nothing would go wrong? Unless the ceremony wasn't just Lucien's coronation, unless it was Adrian's execution. The realization settled over Selene like a cold sheet. Lucien wasn't gathering evidence to confront his cousin. He was building a case to present to the family. A trial with a foregone conclusion, held in front of every person who mattered, designed to accomplish 2 things simultaneously: legitimize Lucien's rule and eliminate his rival in a single, bloody stroke. 3 days wasn't a timeline for investigation. It was a countdown to a killing. And Selene was locked in a penthouse, carrying the child of a man who was planning a public execution. And the only people who knew where she was were the same people who would pull the trigger. She went to the bathroom, closed the door, sat on the floor with her back against the tub, and pressed her hands against her face until the pressure behind her eyes eased enough to think. The question wasn't whether Lucien was capable of it. She'd known what he was since the night he showed her the photographs in his office. The question was whether she could live inside it, not alongside it, not adjacent to it, but inside it, breathing the same air, sharing a bed with a man who would walk into a room on Saturday night and watch his cousin die. The answer came faster than she expected. Yes. Not because she was okay with it, not because she'd made peace with violence or rationalized murder or convinced herself that the Moretti way was justified, but because the alternative, pretending she didn't know, pretending the world was different than it was, pretending that the father of her child was something other than exactly what he'd told her he was from the beginning, was a kind of cowardice she couldn't afford. She was going to stay. She was going to have this baby, and she was going to do it with her eyes open, even if what she saw made her sick. But she was not going to sit in this apartment and wait. That afternoon, she found the flaw. Enzo's coffee break at 2:15 p.m. 4 minutes. The service elevator. The maintenance door in the parking garage. She'd memorized the sequence over 4 days of careful observation, turning the penthouse into a surveillance post, tracking patterns with the same relentless attention she'd once used to track table rotations and tip averages. At 2:14 p.m., she walked to the front door of the apartment and knocked from the inside. The guard posted outside, a thick-necked man named Paolo, who smelled like cologne and cigarette smoke, opened the door. "I need towels," Selene said. "The bathroom closet is empty." Paolo frowned. Towels were not in his job description. He spoke into his radio, got a response, turned his back for exactly 8 seconds to relay the information to someone down the hall. Selene was already past him, not running, walking, quickly, purposefully, with the confident stride of someone who belonged exactly where they were going. She'd learned that walk working at La Maison, the way managers and owners moved through a restaurant like they owned every square foot, and how no one ever stopped them because authority is mostly performance, and performance is mostly posture. She hit the service elevator in 12 seconds. The keycard was the problem, except it wasn't, because she'd watched the maintenance crew swipe in that morning through the bedroom window's reflection and memorized the position of the card reader relative to the crew member's belt. The crew wore their cards on retractable clips at their left hips. The woman who cleaned the 47th floor left her spare card on the cleaning cart, tucked into the apron pocket. The apron was hanging in the hallway closet. The closet wasn't locked. The card was exactly where Selene expected it to be. The elevator dropped 47 floors in 31 seconds. The parking garage was cold, gray, and nearly empty at this hour. The maintenance door was propped open with a rubber wedge, a fire code violation that the building manager apparently didn't care about. Selene stepped outside into daylight for the first time in 4 days. The sun hit her face and she gasped, an involuntary animal sound, the sound of a body remembering what freedom feels like after forgetting. She had no money, no phone. Hers was still cracked and dead in her apartment 11 miles away. No plan beyond the next 60 seconds. But she had an address. She'd heard it through the bathroom vent 2 nights ago. Marco speaking to someone about a surveillance operation. A location. A warehouse on the docks where, according to Lucien's intelligence, Adrian had been meeting with Petrov's people for 8 months. If Lucien was building a case for Saturday, the evidence would be there. The real evidence, not the filtered version Lucien's people would present to the family, but the raw material. Messages, recordings, whatever proof existed of Adrian's betrayal. And Selene needed to see it for herself. Not because she doubted Lucien's conclusion. Adrian had tried to have her killed, and she believed that with the certainty of a woman who'd felt marble shrapnel tear her skin. But because she didn't trust anyone else's version of the truth anymore. Not Lucien's, not Marco's. Not the manicured narrative that would be presented to the family on Saturday like a prosecution's closing argument. She needed to know what was real. Because she was about to raise a child in this world, and the first lesson that child would learn was how to tell the difference between truth and performance. She found a bus stop 3 blocks from the building, waited 11 minutes, boarded the Route 9 heading east, standing because she had no fare, and the driver led her on with a look that said he'd had a long day and didn't care. Rode 17 stops to the harbor district where the buildings got shorter and the streets got rougher, and the air tasted like salt and diesel. The warehouse was exactly where Marco had said it would be. A squat concrete building at the end of Pier 11, sandwiched between a defunct shipping company and a marine equipment supplier that looked like it hadn't opened in years. No signage, no visible security. Just a rusted metal door with a padlock that hung open, because whoever had used this place last hadn't bothered to secure it, or because they wanted it found. Selene pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dim, industrial. Concrete floors stained with oil and age, metal shelving units lined the walls, mostly empty. The air smelled like mildew and something chemical. Cleaning solution, maybe, or the residue of whatever had been stored here before it became a meeting ground for traders. She found the table in the back corner. A folding table, the kind you buy at a hardware store for $20. On it, 3 burner phones, a laptop, and a manila folder thick enough to choke on. Selene opened the folder. Photographs. Dozens of them. Surveillance shots taken from multiple angles with long lenses, and the subjects weren't Adrian meeting with Petrov's men in shadowy back rooms. They were Lucien. Lucien entering a building she didn't recognize. Lucien shaking hands with a man in a gray suit whose face she couldn't see. Lucien seated across from someone at a restaurant, not La Maison, somewhere else, somewhere private, with documents spread between them. Lucien on the phone, taken through the window of his own car. and paper-clipped to the photographs a series of printed documents, financial transfers, account numbers, routing codes. She didn't understand all of it, but she understood enough to see that money was moving, large amounts, 7 figures, from accounts she didn't recognize into accounts that bore the Moretti name. At the bottom of the stack, a single handwritten note on plain white paper. No signature, no date. The note read, "He's been moving money since March. The old man doesn't know. When the time comes, show this to Salvatore, and the captains will follow." Selene read it twice, 3 times, 4. The room tilted, not physically, but the framework through which she understood everything. Every conversation, every decision, every moment since she'd climbed into that car in the rain shifted on its axis, and the picture that emerged from the new angle was one she wasn't prepared for. This wasn't Adrian's war room. This was Adrian's evidence against Lucien. And either Adrian was framing Lucien for financial betrayal, building a case to present to the family that would paint the heir as the real traitor, or Lucien had been lying to her from the beginning, and the money trail was real, and the man she'd chosen to trust was not just violent, but corrupt in a way that went beyond crime family politics into something personal and calculated. Either way, one of them was lying. And she was standing in a warehouse on the docks, alone, pregnant, holding proof that would destroy whichever one was telling the truth. She heard the footsteps behind her too late. "I was hoping you'd find this place," a voice said. Selene turned. Her hand tightened on the folder. Her other hand went to her stomach. Adrian Moretti stood in the warehouse doorway with 2 men behind him. His green eyes caught the dim light and threw it back brighter, colder. His easy smile was gone. In its place was something she recognized from every powerful man who'd ever looked down at her. The expression of someone who has already decided what you are and is simply waiting for you to confirm it. "We need to talk about your boyfriend," Adrian said, "and what he's really been planning behind his father's back." He stepped inside. The door closed behind him, and Selene realized with a clarity that tasted like iron on her tongue that she had just walked out of one cage and directly into another. The warehouse smelled like rust and the end of choices. Selene didn't move. Her fingers pressed into the manila folder so hard the edges cut into her palm. Behind her, the table with its burner phones and laptop hummed faintly in the silence. In front of her, Adrian Moretti stepped forward with the unhurried confidence of a man walking into a room he'd already won. His 2 men fanned out, one to her left, blocking the shelving aisle, one to her right, cutting off the only other path to the door. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. The geometry of the room made the threat perfectly clear. "Sit down," Adrian said. He pulled a metal folding chair from behind a shelf and placed it in front of the table, angled toward her like an interview setup. "Please." "I'll stand." "You'll sit." The smile dropped. Underneath it was something flat and functional, like the face of a clock stripped of its decorative housing. "You're in my space, holding my property, and you got here because I wanted you to get here. So when I say sit, I mean sit." Selene sat, not because she was afraid, though she was in the deep animal way that makes your scalp tingle and your vision sharpen, but because the folder in her hands was leverage, and leverage only works if you're alive to use it. Adrian pulled a second chair across the floor. The metal legs screamed against concrete. He sat down 3 feet from her, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and studied her with those cold green eyes. "How much did he tell you?" Adrian asked. "Enough." "Enough meaning what? That I'm the traitor? That I've been selling family secrets to the Petrovs? That I tried to have you killed in the garden?" Selene said nothing. Her heartbeat was visible in her throat. She could feel it jumping against her skin, a tiny, persistent pulse that she couldn't hide and didn't try to. Adrian nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something. "He told you the story he needed you to believe. The one where he's the noble heir protecting his family from the treacherous cousin. Clean, simple. The kind of story a woman who's carrying his child would want to be true. And you're going to tell me a different story? I'm going to tell you the real one." He reached past her to the table and flipped open the laptop. The screen lit up, blue-white light washing over both their faces. He typed a password, opened a folder, turned the screen toward her. Spreadsheets. Bank records. Transfer histories going back 14 months, each entry highlighted in yellow with annotations in Italian that she couldn't fully read, but whose numbers were universal. Your boyfriend, Adrian said, has been siphoning money from the family for over a year. Not small money, not pocket cash. We're talking about $23 million redirected from family operations into offshore accounts that only he controls. Why would he steal from his own family? He's about to inherit the whole thing. Because inheriting an empire means inheriting its debts, its enemies, its obligations, every captain, every lieutenant, every associate who's owed a favor. Lucien doesn't want to inherit the Moretti syndicate. He wants to gut it, take the money, collapse the structure, and rebuild from scratch with only the people he trusts. Which, in case you're counting, is about 4 people. And you're one of them. Selene stared at the screen. The numbers blurred and sharpened as her eyes struggled to focus. The Petrov meetings, she said. If they weren't yours, they were mine. I won't lie to you about that. But they weren't what Lucien told you they were. I went to Petrov because I needed proof. The money trail, the offshore accounts. I found the first irregularities 8 months ago. I brought it to my uncle, Salvatore. You know what he said? What? He said I was jealous, that I was making up stories because I couldn't stand that Lucien was chosen over me. He wouldn't even look at the documents. Adrian's jaw tightened. She watched a muscle jump beneath the skin like something trying to escape. So I went outside the family. The only people with the resources to independently verify Moretti financial records are the people who've been trying to destroy us for 20 years. I went to Petrov, not as an ally, as a source. And the sniper in the garden? Adrian leaned back. His expression changed. Something that looked alarmingly like genuine pain flickered across his features before he extinguished it. I don't know who sent the shooter. I have theories, but I can tell you this. It wasn't me. If I wanted you dead, you would be dead. I've had the opportunity every day for the last 2 weeks. I know the flaws in Lucien's security better than he does. I know about Enzo's coffee break. I know about the maintenance door. How do you think you got here? The realization hit her stomach like a fist. You let me escape. I created the path. The cleaning woman with the keycard, she works for me. The bus route that conveniently stops 3 blocks from this warehouse, I suggested this location to Marco 6 months ago specifically because of the transit access. He paused. I needed you to come here on your own. Because if I'd taken you, Lucien would have burned the city looking for you. But if you left on your own, he'd have to ask himself why. Selene's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the folder in her lap. Why me? She asked. Why not bring this to the captains yourself? Because the captains are loyal to the bloodline, not to the truth. They'll follow whoever sits in the chair on Saturday night. If I walk in with these documents, I'm a jealous cousin trying to stage a coup. But if you walk in, the mother of the heir, Lucien's own woman, carrying his child and carrying proof, the story changes. They can't dismiss you as a rival. You're the one person in the world who should want Lucien to succeed. And if I bring this to them, and it turns out you're lying, Adrian held her gaze. Then I'm dead by Sunday morning, and Lucien becomes the most powerful man on the East Coast, and you'll have earned his trust forever. And if you're telling the truth, then Lucien goes down. The family restructures. I take the chair, not because I want it, but because someone has to. And you and that baby get a life outside this. Protection, money, a fresh start somewhere nobody knows the name Moretti. Selene looked at the laptop screen, looked at the folder, looked at the green eyes of a man who was either saving her or using her, and the hell of it was that she couldn't tell which. I need time, she said. You don't have time. The ceremony is Saturday. That's 2 days. If Lucien finds out you're here, if he finds out you've seen this, he'll lock you in that penthouse until the baby is born and you'll never see daylight again. Not because he's cruel, because he's afraid. And frightened men with power are the most dangerous thing in the world. Selene stood up. The chair scraped back. Adrian's 2 men shifted but didn't move. I'm taking the folder, she said. That's why it's here. And I'm leaving. Right now, through that door, and nobody follows me. Adrian studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded at his men. They stepped back. The path to the door opened. Saturday night, Adrian said as she reached the doorway. The ceremony starts at 9. The old opera house on 5th and Cathedral. Whatever you decide before then. Because after that, it won't matter. Selene stepped into the daylight. The salt air hit her face. The sun was low over the harbor, turning the water into a sheet of hammered copper. She pressed the folder against her chest and walked. She didn't go back to the penthouse. She went to the only place left that still belonged to her, the apartment with the peeling wallpaper and the dripping faucet and the cracked phone lying on the bathroom floor. She climbed the stairs on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Let herself in with the key she'd hidden above the door frame months ago because she'd always known, somewhere deep in her survival instincts, that she might need a place to run to. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. Small, cold. The air tasted stale. The refrigerator hummed its broken, irregular hum. Water spots on the ceiling had grown into new shapes while she was gone, like the apartment itself had continued aging without her. She sat on the bed, spread the folder's contents across the blanket, and for the next 3 hours she went through every document, every photograph, every financial record, line by line, number by number, teaching herself to read the architecture of betrayal. Some of it was beyond her: offshore banking structures, shell company formations, routing protocols. She didn't have the expertise, but some of it was simple arithmetic. Money going in, money coming out. The same accounts appearing again and again, linked to entities with names that sounded like bad fiction, but whose registration numbers were real and traceable. And in the middle of it all, one detail that stopped her cold. A transfer dated 3 weeks ago, 14 days before the garden shooting. $200,000 moved from one of the flagged offshore accounts into a domestic account registered to a company called Blackridge Security Solutions. She'd seen that name before, on the ID badges of the men who guarded Lucien's penthouse. Lucien's own security company, funded by money he was allegedly stealing from his family, which meant one of two things. Either Adrian had fabricated the entire paper trail with enough sophistication to fool a forensic accountant, planting fake records inside real financial systems, or Lucien had been using stolen family money to fund the private army that surrounded her every day. The army that locked her in. The army that protected her. The army that was, depending on who was telling the truth, either her shield or her cage. Her cracked phone still had enough battery for one call if she plugged it into the charger. The screen was spiderwebbed but functional. She stared at it for 10 minutes, thumb hovering over Lucien's number, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. She didn't call Lucien. She called the restaurant. Gerald answered on the third ring, frantic as always. La Maison, how may I? Gerald, it's Selene. Selene? Where the hell have you been? You've missed 6 shifts. I've had to... Gerald, shut up and listen. Lucien Moretti. He's been coming to the restaurant for how long? What? I don't... How long, Gerald? A pause. She heard him swallow. 18 months. Maybe longer. He had a standing reservation before you even started in Section 4. Before I started in Section 4, you're sure? I'm sure. He was in Section 2 originally. He requested the transfer to 4 about... Gerald paused. About 6 months after you started working. He asked for you specifically, told the owner he wanted the waitress with the bad shoulder and the attitude. The room shrank. The walls pressed in. Selene sat on the edge of her bed and felt the last piece of the puzzle slide into place with a sound like a bone snapping. Lucien hadn't found her by accident. The car in the parking lot, the unlocked door, the heated seats, the perfectly timed encounter during a thunderstorm, none of it was chance. He'd been watching her for a year before they ever spoke. He'd transferred to her section. He'd engineered proximity. And when the moment came, when the car was repossessed and the rain was brutal and she was desperate enough to climb into a stranger's vehicle, he was there, waiting, like a trap designed to look like shelter. She hung up on Gerald mid-sentence, put the phone down, put her head between her knees and breathed until the black spots at the edges of her vision retreated. Then she got up, splashed water on her face, looked at herself in the mirror, pale, hollow-eyed, a woman aged 5 years and 3 weeks, and made a decision. She wasn't going to confront Lucien. She wasn't going to confront Adrian. She wasn't going to play their game, choose their sides, serve as a weapon in a war between 2 men who had both lied to her in different ways for different reasons. She was going to the ceremony, and she was going to do something neither of them expected. She was going to tell the truth. Saturday night arrived with the kind of theatrical weather that felt scripted. Low clouds, distant thunder, the city wrapped in a bruised purple light that made every building look like a set piece. Selene had spent the last 36 hours preparing. Not physically. She wore the same black consignment dress, now wrinkled, because it was the only armor she had. Mentally. She went through the folder one more time, memorized the key numbers, the account names, the dates. She didn't need to bring the documents. She needed to be the document. The opera house was impossible to miss. A massive stone building with columns and arched windows that blazed with golden light, surrounded by a fleet of black vehicles and a perimeter of men in dark suits whose watchful stillness radiated threat, like heat from asphalt. She walked up to the front entrance in her scuffed borrowed shoes, and the two guards flanking the door stared at her like she'd materialized from thin air. "I'm Selene Vale," she said. "I'm carrying Lucien Moretti's child. You can search me, scan me, do whatever you need to do. But if you don't let me through that door in the next 10 seconds, you're going to have to explain to your boss why the mother of his heir is standing on the sidewalk while his coronation goes sideways without her." They let her through. The interior of the opera house was staggering. Red velvet curtains draped from balconies 3 stories high. Crystal chandeliers, dozens of them, cast prismatic light across a main floor that had been transformed into something between a throne room and a banquet hall. Tables lined the perimeter. A raised platform stood at the far end where a single leather chair sat empty beneath a spotlight. The throne. The room was packed. 200 people, maybe more. Men in tuxedos, women in gowns. The same mix she'd seen at the estate. Politicians beside criminals, wealth beside violence. The entire ecosystem of power gathered in one place to witness the transfer of a crown that didn't officially exist. She saw Salvatore first. The old king sat at the central table, silver hair immaculate, black eyes surveying the room with the patient vigilance of a man who had survived 4 decades of betrayal. He saw her enter. His expression didn't change, but his gaze tracked her across the room like a scope. Then she saw Adrian, standing near the bar with 2 men she didn't recognize, a glass of champagne in his hand, his green eyes scanning the crowd. When he saw Selene, something shifted in his posture. Surprise, then calculation, then a careful blankness that told her he was recalculating in real time. And then she saw Lucien. He was on the platform, standing beside the empty chair. His tuxedo was black. His face was carved from the same material as the columns holding up the building, stone, rigid, ancient. 2 men flanked him, both armed, both watching the crowd with the flat focus of professionals. When he saw Selene, he went white. Not pale, white. The color drained from his face so completely and so fast that it looked like something had been pulled out of him, a plug removed, a vital connection severed. His eyes found hers across 300 feet of chandelier light and red velvet, and she could see, even from that distance, the war erupting inside him. Relief that she was alive, terror that she was here, and beneath both, the dawning, sickening recognition that she knew something she wasn't supposed to know. He stepped off the platform. She walked toward him. They met in the center of the room, surrounded by 200 people who had no idea that the collision they were witnessing was about to tear the Moretti Empire apart at its foundations. "How did you get here?" Lucien said. His voice was low, strained, the voice of a man holding a crumbling wall together with his bare hands. "I walked out of your cage." "Selene, how long were you watching me before we met?" The question hit him like a bullet. She watched it enter, saw the impact register in his eyes, in the micro-flinch of his jaw, in the way his hands curled at his sides. "Who told you that?" "Answer me." The room was still buzzing with conversation around them, but a pocket of silence was forming, spreading outward like a ripple. People were noticing. The future king and his pregnant woman standing 3 feet apart with the body language of 2 people about to detonate. 14 months, Lucien said, quietly, like he was laying a weapon on the ground. "I saw you at the restaurant 14 months before that night in the car. And you engineered the meeting. I created an opportunity. I didn't force you to get in. You waited for me to be desperate enough that I didn't have a choice." His eyes flashed. "You always had a choice." "Did I? Did I have a choice when you took my blood? Did I have a choice when you locked me in your apartment? Did I have a choice when you decided to tell your father about my pregnancy before you told me?" Her voice had risen. Not shouting, not yet, but loud enough that the pocket of silence was spreading faster now. Heads were turning, conversations were dying. And Selene didn't care. She was done being quiet, done being managed, done being a piece on a board she couldn't see. "The offshore accounts," she said. $23 million, Blackridge Security. "Are they real?" The color that had drained from Lucien's face didn't return. If anything, he went whiter, a man watching his own foundation crack in real time. "Where did you Are they real?" He stared at her. The chandeliers threw light across his face in shifting patterns. Gold, white, gold. And in that oscillation, she searched for the truth the way you search for a pulse. Something alive. Something real beneath the masks and the money and the violence. "Yes," he said. One word, delivered without defense, without excuse, without the careful framing of a man who was still trying to control the narrative. Just yes. The room heard it. The pocket of silence had become total now. 200 people stood frozen, drinks halfway to lips, conversations abandoned, every eye fixed on the heir and the woman who had just forced him to confess in front of his entire kingdom. And then Adrian moved. He stepped out from the bar, walked toward the platform. His voice carried across the silent room with the clear, projected confidence of a man who had been rehearsing this moment for months. "You heard him," Adrian said. "The heir to the Moretti throne has been stealing from this family for over a year. $23 million moved into accounts only he controls, funded his own private army with family money, and now he stands before you asking for the crown." He paused at the base of the platform, turned to face the room. "I have the documents, the financial records, the proof, and I am asking, as a Moretti by blood, for this family to see the truth before it's too late." The room erupted, not in noise, in movement. Men pushing back from tables, hands reaching for jackets. Security detail shifting positions, their hands dropping to their waistbands. The captains, grizzled men with scarred hands and flat eyes who ran the operational wings of the empire, exchanged glances that carried the weight of decades of loyalty and suspicion. Salvatore hadn't moved. The old king sat at his table with his wine glass untouched, watching the chaos unfold with an expression of absolute terrifying stillness. His black eyes moved from Adrian to Lucy, Yen to Selene and back again, processing, calculating, dissecting the situation with the surgical precision of a man who had survived 40 years of exactly this kind of betrayal. Lucien stepped forward, toward Adrian, toward the crowd, toward the implosion of everything he'd been building toward his entire life. "The money is real," he said. His voice cut through the room like a blade through paper. "I moved it, every dollar, every transfer, and I would do it again." Adrian's smile was triumphant for exactly 2 seconds. "I moved it," Lucien continued, "because 6 months ago I discovered that 3 of our captains were funneling operations revenue into Petrov accounts. 3 men in this room right now who have been selling us to our enemies for 2 years. The offshore accounts were a trap, a mirror of their own methods, designed to trace the money back to its source. Blackridge Security was the team I built to monitor them without using family infrastructure that they'd already compromised." He paused. Let the word settle. "The 3 captains are Rossi, Vitale, and De Luca." 3 men at 3 different tables went very, very still. "And the man who recruited them," Lucien said, turning to face his cousin with an expression that had moved beyond anger into something colder, something geological, "was Adrian." The room held its breath. Adrian's face changed. The triumph collapsed. Underneath it, for one naked, unguarded second, Selene saw raw fear. The real Adrian, not the charming cousin, not the concerned whistleblower, but the cornered animal behind both masks, stared back at Lucien with the wide-eyed recognition of a man who had just realized he'd been outplayed at his own game. "That's a lie," Adrian said, but his voice cracked on the second word, a hairline fracture that the entire room heard. "Marco," Lucien said. The head of security stepped from the shadows near the platform carrying a tablet. He walked it to Salvatore's table and placed it in front of the old king without a word. On the screen, Selene could see it from where she stood, the brightness cutting through the ambient light, were recordings, audio files, surveillance footage, the real evidence. Not the curated folder Adrian had left for Selene to find, but the complete record, 8 months of intercepted communications. Meetings, transfers, Adrian's voice, speaking to men who worked for Yuri Petrov, outlining the exact plan he'd dismissed as fabrication 20 minutes ago. Salvatore looked at the tablet, then at Adrian. His black eyes held nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no surprise. Just the blank, terrible clarity of a man confronting a conclusion he'd reached long ago and simply hadn't wanted to confirm. "You came to me 8 months ago," Salvatore said quietly, "and told me Lucien was stealing from us. I told you it wasn't true. Not because I didn't believe you, but because I already knew what you were doing and I wanted to see how far you'd go." Adrian's face collapsed completely. "Papa," he started. "Don't." The word was a door slamming. Salvatore didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Don't call me that. Not tonight." The three captains, Rossi, Vitale, De Luca, tried to move simultaneously. Rossi reached for his weapon. Vitale shoved back from his table. De Luca was the fastest, making it 4 steps toward the exit before Lucien's security intercepted all three with the mechanical efficiency of men who had rehearsed this exact scenario. And in the chaos, Adrian ran, not toward the exit, toward Selene. He covered the distance in 3 seconds. His hand closed around her arm, hard enough to bruise, hard enough that she felt the bones in her wrist grind against each other. And he pulled her backward toward the stage door, a heavy metal exit behind the platform that led to the backstage labyrinth of the old opera house. Selene didn't scream. She twisted, drove her elbow back into Adrian's ribs with every pound of force her body could generate. The same body that had carried trays for 6 years, that had scrubbed floors and lifted crates and survived on anger and endurance. The blow connected. Adrian grunted. His grip loosened for 1 second. 1 second was enough. She ripped free, stumbled, caught herself on the edge of the platform, and when she turned, Adrian was 3 feet away with a gun in his hand. Pulled from somewhere, an ankle holster, a waistband. She didn't know, and it didn't matter because the barrel was pointed at her chest, and his eyes had gone somewhere beyond reason, beyond strategy, into the desperate cornered place where men stop calculating and start destroying. "Nobody moves!" Adrian shouted. His voice cracked again. Worse this time, the fracture spreading. "Nobody takes a step or I put a bullet through her and the baby." The room froze. 200 people, armed security, the most dangerous men on the East Coast, all of them stopped dead by the sight of a gun pressed toward the stomach of a pregnant woman. And then Lucien stepped off the platform, slowly, hands at his sides, his weapon holstered, his face completely blank, but not the controlled blankness he wore like armor. Something different. Something emptied out. Like a man who had moved past every human emotion and arrived at a place where only one thing remained. "Adrian, he said. Calm. Quiet. The voice of deep water. "Stay back." "You know how this ends." "I said stay back." Lucien kept walking. 1 step, 2, 3. Each one measured, deliberate, closing the distance between himself and the gun with the steady inevitability of a tide that no one on earth could hold back. Selene watched him come. Her eyes met his across the barrel of Adrian's weapon, and in that look, that single, infinite, devastating look, she understood everything Lucien Moretti had ever tried to tell her and everything he never could. He wasn't walking toward danger. He was walking toward her, and he would not stop. Adrian's hand was shaking. The gun trembled in his grip. Sweat ran down his temple and dripped off his jaw. His breathing came in short, ragged bursts. The sound of a man whose body was flooding with adrenaline that had nowhere to go. Lucien was 10 feet away. 8, 6. "I'll do it," Adrian whispered. But the whisper was the confession, the crack that ran all the way through, because his hand was shaking too badly to aim, and his eyes were wet, and somewhere inside the ambition and the betrayal and the desperation was a man who had grown up in the same house as Lucien, who had played in the same hallways, who had called the same man Papa. And he couldn't pull the trigger. Lucien reached him, closed his hand around the barrel of the gun, and pushed it down. Slowly, gently, the way you lower a child's arm when they're holding something they shouldn't have. Adrian's face crumpled. "I was supposed to be the one," Adrian said. His voice broke completely. Tears cut tracks through the sweat on his face. "It was supposed to be me." Lucien took the gun, stepped back. And for 1 second, 1 breath, 1 heartbeat, something that looked like grief passed across his face. Then it was gone. He turned to the room, to the captains, to his father, to the 200 witnesses who had just watched the Moretti Empire tear itself apart and reassemble in the space of 10 minutes. He didn't raise the gun. He didn't shout. He didn't declare anything. He just looked at Selene, and she looked back. And in the silence of that ruined opera house, surrounded by velvet and crystal and the wreckage of a dynasty's worst night, Selene Vale put her hand on her stomach and nodded. One nod, that was all. Lucien turned to his cousin, raised the gun, and the room held its breath for the last time. The gunshot never came. Lucien held the weapon level with Adrian's forehead for 3 seconds. 3 seconds that stretched across the silent opera house like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Every person in the room saw it. The stillness of his hand, the absence of tremor, the absolute mechanical readiness of a man who had been trained to kill before he'd been taught to read. Adrian didn't flinch, didn't close his eyes. He stood with tears still wet on his face and looked at Lucien with the resigned exhaustion of a man who had already died inside and was just waiting for his body to catch up. Selene watched from 6 feet away. Her hand was still on her stomach. Her breath was still caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat, trapped in the same suspension that held the entire room hostage. And then Lucien lowered the gun. Not slowly, not dramatically. He just dropped his arm to his side in a single decisive motion. The motion of a man making a choice that cost him something no one in the room would ever fully understand. "Get him out of my sight," Lucien said. His voice was flat, scraped clean of everything. No rage, no mercy, no satisfaction, just the exhausted pragmatism of a man who had measured the cost of killing his cousin against the cost of letting him live and decided that the cheaper option was the one that didn't require him to explain a bloodstain to the woman carrying his child. Marco moved immediately. 2 security personnel flanked Adrian, gripping his arms with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before. Adrian didn't resist. His legs seemed to have lost the ability to support independent motion. He sagged between the 2 men like a puppet whose strings had been cut, his green eyes glazed, his mouth slightly open, the posture of total defeat. As they dragged him toward the side exit, Adrian's head turned. One last look, not at Lucien, at Selene. She met his gaze, held it. And in that final exchange, 2 seconds, maybe 3, something passed between them that she would carry for a long time. Not sympathy, not forgiveness. Recognition. The recognition of 2 people who had both been used as pieces in a game designed by men who loved power more than they loved the people closest to them. Then Adrian was gone. The side door closed behind him, and the opera house exhaled. The captains who hadn't been named, the loyal ones, the men who had spent decades in the Moretti structure and survived by knowing when to stand and when to kneel, rose from their tables, one by one. Not applauding, not cheering, just standing. A silent acknowledgement that the succession was complete, the challenge had been answered, and the new king had proven himself not by the blood he'd spilled, but by the blood he'd chosen not to. Rossi, Vitale, and De Luca were escorted from the room through separate exits, each flanked by security teams that moved with the coordinated silence of men executing a plan rehearsed to the minute. No one spoke to them. No one looked at them. They simply ceased to exist in the social architecture of the room, erased from the family's collective awareness with a completeness that was more terrifying than any execution could have been. Salvatore stood last. The old king pushed back his chair with a deliberate scrape that cut through the residual tension like a blade. He picked up his wine glass, still full, untouched through the entire confrontation, and walked toward the platform where his son stood alone. The room watched. Salvatore stopped in front of Lucien. Father and son. The same jaw. The same posture. But different eyes. Salvatore's black and bottomless. Lucien's amber and burning with something that Selene was only now beginning to understand was not rage but grief. Salvatore raised his glass. "To the king," he said. Simply. Without ceremony. Without warmth. The way a man acknowledges a fact he had nothing to do with, like weather or gravity. He drank, set the glass on the platform's edge, and without another word walked out of the opera house through the main doors, his silhouette framed for one moment against the night sky before the doors swung shut and he was gone. No embrace, no blessing, no hand on the shoulder, Just a toast from a man who understood that power is not given, it is survived. Lucien stood on the platform for a long moment after his father left. The room began to move again around him. Conversations resuming, drinks being poured, the machinery of social performance grinding back into motion with the resilient efficiency of people accustomed to witnessing violence and continuing their evenings. But Lucien didn't move. He stood perfectly still with the gun still hanging at his side and stared at the door his father had walked through with an expression that Selene had never seen on his face before. Loss. Not the loss of something taken, the loss of something that had never been offered. She walked to him. Her shoes were scuffed, her dress was wrinkled, her hair had come loose from whatever arrangement she'd attempted 48 hours ago, and hung around her face in dark, exhausted tangles. She looked nothing like the women in this room. The diamonds, the designer gowns, the careful architecture of wealth displayed like plumage. She looked like what she was, a tired, pregnant, furious woman who had survived the worst week of her life and was still standing. She climbed the 3 steps to the platform, stood in front of him, reached up, and took the gun from his hand. He let her. His fingers opened without resistance, releasing the weapon the way you release something you're ashamed to be holding. She set it on the empty chair, the throne, the symbol, the thing that had driven every decision and every betrayal and every bullet fired in the last 3 weeks, and left it there. "Come with me," she said. He looked at her. His eyes were red. Not crying. Selene wasn't sure Lucien Moretti had the physiological capacity for tears, but red with exhaustion and adrenaline crash, and the particular kind of emotional depletion that comes from holding yourself together through a catastrophe and only realizing afterward how close you came to falling apart. "Where?" he asked. "Outside. I need air. You need air. And if I spend one more minute in this building, I'm going to scream." They walked out together. Through the main hall, past the tables, past the remaining guests who parted for them without being asked. Out the front doors, down the stone steps, into the night. The air was cool. Early autumn cool, carrying the distant smell of the harbor and the closer smell of rain-wet concrete. The city stretched around them in every direction, glittering and oblivious, a million lives playing out behind a million windows, none of them aware that the power structure beneath their feet had just shifted on its axis. Selene sat on the bottom step. Lucien sat beside her. Their shoulders touched. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The silence was different from every other silence they'd shared. Not charged, not loaded, not the tense, electric quiet of 2 people navigating around the things they couldn't say. This was the silence that comes after the storm, after the sirens, after the adrenaline drains, and the body realizes it's still alive and doesn't quite know what to do with that information. "You knew," Selene said finally, "about Adrian, the whole time." "Not the whole time, 6 months. I found the first evidence 6 months ago, 2 months before I met you. Before you arranged to meet me." He was quiet for a beat. "Yes." "Was I part of it? The plan? Was meeting me part of the strategy?" The question sat between them like an unexploded device. Selene felt her own pulse in her ears, steady now, slower than it had been inside, the rhythm of a woman who had moved past fear into the territory beyond it, where the only thing left is the need to know. Lucien turned to look at her. His face was stripped bare. No mask, no control. Just the raw topography of a man who was about to say something that would either save or end the only thing he'd ever wanted to keep. "I noticed you 14 months ago," he said. "That part is true. I watched you work. I watched you carry impossible loads without complaining. I watched you eat scraps when you thought nobody was looking and give your tips to the busboy whose kid was sick. I watched you move through a world that had given you nothing and never once let it make you cruel." He paused. "I transferred to your section because I wanted to be near you. I wanted to understand how someone could survive what you'd survived and still be intact. Still be good." "That's not an answer." "I'm getting there." He looked at his hands. The scars across his knuckles caught the streetlight. Old wounds, long-healed, permanent records of violence, committed by fingers that had also traced the curve of her jaw in the dark. "I knew Adrian was a problem. I knew the succession would be a war. And I knew that having an heir, a child, a next generation, would strengthen my position. That's the truth. I thought about it in those terms, political terms, strategic terms. You targeted me. I created circumstances where we would meet, the car, the rain. I didn't plan every detail. I didn't repossess your car. I didn't create the storm. But I knew your schedule. I knew your financial situation. I knew that sooner or later something would break, and when it did, I'd be there. Selene's jaw tightened. She felt the anger rise, hot, familiar, the same anger that had kept her alive for 6 years. And she let it burn through her chest and her throat and her clenched fists, because suppressing it would be another form of the compliance she'd sworn to stop practicing. And the blood test, she said. The pregnancy. Was that strategic too? No. The word came out rough, damaged, like something dragged over gravel. The blood test was fear, pure fear. I woke up that morning and looked at you sleeping in my bed and realized that if you were pregnant, everything changed. Not politically. Everything. Every plan I'd ever made, every calculation, every cold, rational structure I'd built my life around. All of it became irrelevant compared to the possibility that there was something growing inside you that was half mine. He turned to her. His eyes were wet now. Not tears. He still wasn't crying, but the sheen of a man fighting a losing battle against his own physiology. I took the blood test because I couldn't wait, because the not knowing was going to kill me. And I told my father before I told you because I was terrified that if you found out first, you'd run, and I'd never find you, and I'd spend the rest of my life knowing I'd had something real and lost it because I was too damaged to handle it like a human being. That's not an excuse. I know. It doesn't fix what you did. I know that too. Selene looked at the city. The lights blurred slightly, her own eyes finally betraying her, moisture gathering at the edges of a composure she'd maintained through gunfire and betrayal and the worst revelations of her life. She blinked it back, pressed her palms against the cold stone step, and felt the solidity of it, the realness, the simple physical fact of a surface that wouldn't shift beneath her. Here's what's going to happen, she said. I'm going to tell you what I need, and you're going to listen. Not negotiate, not manage, listen. I'm listening. I need the truth, every time, even when it's ugly, even when you think it'll make me run. I'd rather know and choose to stay than be comfortable and discover I was living in a lie. Okay, I need my own space, not your penthouse, not your world, somewhere that belongs to me, that I can walk out of whenever I want, with a door that I lock and unlock with my own key. Okay. I need you to never, ever make a decision about my body or my child without telling me first. Not for my protection, not for the family, not for any reason. My body is mine. This baby is ours. But my body is mine. Yes. And I need to know what happened to Adrian. Lucien was quiet for a moment. The sounds of the city filled the pause. Distant traffic, a siren somewhere to the south, the low hum of a world that kept moving regardless of the wars being fought inside its buildings. He's alive, Lucien said. He'll be taken to a facility outside the country, monitored, contained. He won't be comfortable, but he won't be harmed. Would you have killed him if I hadn't been there? The pause that followed was the most honest thing Lucien had ever given her. Not because of what he said, but because of how long it took him to say it. The pause of a man genuinely considering the question rather than reaching for the answer that would serve him best. Yes, he said. I would have. Why didn't you? He looked at her. The amber in his eyes had softened, not warmer exactly, but less sharp, like a blade that had been resheathed but not discarded. Because you were watching. And I realized that the man I want to be for this child can't be the same man I was trained to be for this family. Both can't exist. I had to choose. And you chose. I chose you. He said it without embellishment, without the poetic weight that the sentence deserved. Just 3 words, plain and flat and exhausted, the way a man states a fact that has cost him everything he thought he was. I'll choose you every time, even when it makes me weaker, even when it costs me. I'll choose you. Selene didn't say anything for a long time. The anger was still there, banked, not extinguished, a coal that would glow for months, maybe years, before it either burned out or caught fire again. The trust wasn't rebuilt. It might never be fully rebuilt. What stood in its place was something less beautiful but more durable. an understanding. A contract between two damaged people who had seen each other at their worst and decided, not with their hearts but with their battered, pragmatic minds, that staying was better than the alternative. She reached over and it took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, tight, almost too tight. The grip of a man who had been holding on to nothing for so long that when something real finally landed in his palm, he didn't know how to calibrate the pressure. "You're hurting my hand," she said. He loosened his grip. Not much, just enough. "Sorry," he whispered. It was the first time she'd ever heard him apologize for anything. The weeks that followed were not peaceful. Peace was a concept that belonged to other people. People whose last names didn't open doors or end lives. People who didn't require armed escorts to buy groceries. But they were quiet. Lucien kept his word. Every word. The apartment he found for Selene was 2 blocks from his penthouse, close enough to reach in minutes, far enough to feel separate. A brownstone walk-up with high ceilings and old hardwood and windows that opened onto a courtyard with a single dogwood tree. She chose it herself, signed the lease herself, held the only key. He didn't lock her in. When she left, for walks, for appointments, for the Tuesday afternoon art classes she'd enrolled in at a community center 3 blocks east, she told him where she was going, and he told her how many security personnel would be nearby, and they negotiated the gap between freedom and safety, the way 2 people negotiate any shared space. Imperfectly, with friction, with the occasional argument that ended in silence and resumed the next morning with coffee, and the stubborn refusal to let disagreement become destruction. The pregnancy progressed. Selene's body changed in ways that fascinated and terrified her in equal measure. The thickening of her waist, the tenderness in places she hadn't known could be tender, the bizarre, specific cravings that struck at 2 in the morning and sent Lucien's security team on covert missions to all-night diners for pickles and orange juice. Lucien was there for all of it. Not hovering. She'd made it clear that hovering would result in consequences she left deliberately unspecified, but present. He came to every doctor's appointment, sat in the waiting room with his scarred hands folded in his lap and his weapon holstered beneath his jacket, looking spectacularly out of place among the expectant mothers and their nervous partners. He asked the doctor questions with the focused intensity of a man studying battlefield intelligence. He held Selene's hand during the ultrasound and said nothing, but his grip tightened when the heartbeat filled the room. That fast, watery percussion, the sound of something impossibly small fighting to exist. She looked at his face in that moment. The mask was gone. Not lowered, not adjusted, gone. And what was underneath it was something she'd caught only in fragments before, in the crack at the estate, in the trembling of his fingers, in the white terror of his face when she'd walked into the opera house. Love. Unprocessed. Unfiltered. The kind that doesn't know how to be gentle because it was raised in a house where gentleness was a liability. She didn't say anything, just squeezed his hand back. They didn't fix each other. That was the thing the stories always got wrong, the idea that love repairs the damage, fills the cracks, makes broken people whole. It didn't. Selene still woke some nights with her heart hammering, reaching for a door handle that wasn't locked, her body remembering the cage even when her mind knew she was free. Lucien still disappeared into phone calls that left his jaw tight and his eyes flat, the violence of his world pressing against the boundaries of the life they were building like water against a dam. But they built it anyway, imperfect, cracked, held together not by romance but by the stubborn, exhausting, daily choice to stay and be honest about how hard staying was. 3 months before the baby was due, Lucien drove her to the coast. Not the Moretti estate, not a property owned by the family or guarded by men with earpieces. A small house on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic, white-painted and wind-beaten, with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides, and a view that made Selene's chest ache with something she'd stopped believing she was allowed to feel. "What is this?" she asked. "Yours," he said. "If you want it. No one knows about it. It's not in any Moretti records. I bought it under a name that doesn't exist, paid in cash, and the nearest neighbor is 2 miles south. It's just a house. By the ocean. For you." She stood on the porch and watched the waves hit the rocks below. The salt air filled her lungs. The wind pulled at her hair. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, the tightness in her chest, The knot that had lived there since she was 18, since her mother's hospital bills arrived, since the world started telling her what she could and couldn't afford to want, loosened. Not gone, just loosened, just enough to breathe. "It's not a cage," Lucien said from behind her. Quietly, almost tentatively, which was not a word she'd ever associated with him before. "There's no code on the door. No guards unless you ask for them. It's just a place where you can be safe, and it has nothing to do with me." She turned to face him. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, framed by white paint and gray sky, and he looked, for the first time since she'd known him, uncertain. Not performing uncertainty, living it. A man who had offered everything he could think of and was genuinely unsure whether it was enough. "It has everything to do with you," she said. "Is that okay?" She almost smiled. Almost. The muscles were out of practice, but they remembered the shape. "Yeah," she said. "It's okay." The wedding was small, not Moretti small, which would have meant 200 guests, a cathedral, and security perimeters spanning city blocks. Actually small. The Cliff House. Sunrise. An officiant who arrived, performed the ceremony, and left within 20 minutes. No politicians, no captains, no extended family except Marco, who stood as witness and spent the entire ceremony scanning the horizon with the professional paranoia of a man who would never fully relax. Selene wore a white dress she'd found at a vintage shop in the coastal town 10 miles south. Simple. Cotton. No beading, no train, no veil. She was 7 months pregnant, and the dress stretched across her stomach in a way that was neither elegant nor flattering, and she didn't care. She stood on the porch with the ocean behind her and the wind in her hair and her hands in Lucien's scarred hands, and she said vows that were 3 sentences long because anything longer would have been performance, and they were both done performing. Lucien wore a dark suit. No tie. Top button undone. The thin silver chain she'd noticed that first night in the car glinted at his collar. He'd had a haircut. He looked almost, if you squinted, if you ignored the scars and the weapon still holstered at his ankle, because some habits are survival instincts that never fully switch off. Like a normal man marrying a normal woman on a normal morning. Almost. He slid the ring onto her finger, a diamond set in platinum, old, heavy with the weight of a previous generation. His mother's ring, he'd told her. The only thing he'd kept from a woman who'd died when he was 12 and whose absence had shaped every cold, controlled, love-starved corner of his personality. "You stepped into my car looking for shelter," he said. His voice was rough, unsteady. The voice of a man speaking words he'd rehearsed 100 times and was still afraid of getting wrong. Selene looked at him, at the scars, at the red-rimmed eyes, at the hands that had held guns and signed death warrants and were now trembling around her fingers like the trembling was the most honest thing they'd ever done. "And I spent every day after that trying to make sure you'd never face another storm alone," he finished. She didn't cry. She'd used up her tears on bathroom floors and cold apartments, and nights spent wondering if she'd made the worst decision of her life. She had nothing left for the good moments except a dry-eyed clarity that felt more real than tears ever could. "You're still not a good man," she said. His mouth twitched. "No. But you're trying. Every day." "Then that's enough." She squeezed his hands, felt the trembling steady, felt her own heartbeat, slow and even and alive, and beneath it, deeper, faster, already impatient, the second heartbeat that would arrive in 2 months and change everything all over again. "That's enough for now." The officiant pronounced them married. Marco clapped once, looked embarrassed, and went back to scanning the tree line. The ocean threw itself against the rocks below with its ancient, indifferent rhythm, and the sun cleared the horizon and poured gold light across the cliff and the house and the 2 people standing on the porch who had no business being happy and were trying anyway. Lucien kissed her, softly. Not the desperate, consuming kisses from before. The penthouse, the restaurant, the nights that tasted like whiskey and recklessness. This was different, careful. The kiss of a man who understood finally that the thing he was holding was not a possession to be secured, but a person who had chosen, freely, with her eyes open, knowing every terrible truth, to stay. Selene kissed him back, and in the space between their mouths, in the fraction of an inch where breath met breath, she felt something settle into place. Not perfection, Not the fairy tale ending that belonged to people who hadn't spent their lives fighting to survive. Something better. Something earned. A beginning. Months later, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and exhaustion, Selene held her son for the first time. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, dark hair, eyes that hadn't decided their color yet but were trending toward amber. A scream that filled the room with the furious, indignant declaration of a new life that had arrived on its own terms and intended to be heard. Lucien stood beside the bed. His jacket was off. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows. He'd been holding Selene's hand for 14 hours of labor, and his fingers bore the crescent-shaped marks of her nails dug into his skin during contractions that had made her vision white out and her voice go raw. He hadn't flinched once. When the nurse placed the baby in his arms, Lucien Moretti, the man who had inherited an empire, who had faced down betrayal and bullets, and the worst his bloodline had to offer, who had walked toward a loaded gun without blinking, held his son like he was made of smoke, like breathing too hard would scatter him, like the 8 pounds of screaming, red-faced humanity in his arms was the most dangerous thing he'd ever held, because it was the only thing in the world that could truly destroy him. "He's loud," Lucien said. His voice cracked on the second word. Selene laughed. An actual laugh, raw, exhausted, scraped from the bottom of a body that had just performed its most extraordinary act. It sounded like something rusted breaking loose, like a door opening that had been painted shut for years. "He's ours," she said. Lucien looked at her. The mask was gone. Had been gone for months, really, peeled away layer by layer through arguments and honesty, and the slow, unglamorous work of learning to trust someone after a lifetime of weaponizing trust. What remained was just a face. Tired, scarred, older than its years, but present. Here. Completely, terrifyingly here. "Ours," he repeated. Outside the hospital window, the city hummed its eternal, restless hum. Somewhere in its concrete veins, the Moretti Empire continued its operations. Money moved, orders were given, men with flat eyes and steady hands conducted the business of power with the mechanical efficiency that Lucien's leadership had refined into something quieter, more controlled, no less dangerous but contained in ways his father's reign had never been. The empire would not stop. The violence would not vanish. The world they lived in would continue to demand things from both of them that no parent should have to give. But in this room, at this moment, none of that existed. There was only a woman who had climbed into the wrong car on the worst night of her life. A man who had waited for her in the rain because he didn't know any other way to reach for something he needed. And a child who would inherit a name that opened doors and closed coffins and carried the weight of 4 decades of accumulated sin. Selene looked at her son, touched his face, felt the impossible softness of new skin against her calloused fingertip. "We're going to do better," she whispered. Not to Lucien, not to the room, to the boy, to the future, to the version of herself that had once painted watercolors and dreamed of a life bigger than survival. "We're going to do so much better." The baby stopped crying. His eyes, those not yet amber, not yet anything eyes, found her face and held it with the blank, total attention of a being who had just arrived in a world he didn't understand yet, but was willing for the moment to trust. Selene held him closer, felt his heartbeat against her chest, and outside the window, beyond the glass and the steel and the city that had tried to crush her and failed, the sun rose over the skyline and turned everything, the buildings, the bridges, the harbor, the kingdom built on blood and concrete, to gold. Not clean gold, not pure gold, but gold nonetheless. And for the first time in her life, Selene Vale, Selene Moretti, closed her eyes and didn't brace for impact. She just breathed.